message series about attitudes, and just to remind ourselves, the premise we've been operating on is that attitudes are a choice. We don't often get to choose the circumstances that we find ourselves in, but our attitudes are a choice. And last Sunday we looked at the attitude of coveting. And so this morning we're going to look at the opposite of that, which is contentment. And I'm going to draw your attention to a passage of Scripture. It's really a very powerful passage of Scripture that deals with this singular issue of contentment. And it comes to us in Paul's letter to the Philippians. And so Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, Paul writes, I am not saying this because I am in need. Now, what he's referring to there is he's just got through thanking other Christians for being supportive of other churches in his ministry, and so he's appreciated their generosity toward all of that. And so he says, I'm not thanking you because I happen now to be in need. For, and this is where it gets really critical for our thinking this morning, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I want you to think about that phrase for just a moment. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through Him, meaning Christ, who gives me strength. A lot of times, that 13th verse is quoted. It's just kind of pulled out and it's quoted in a silo. And a lot of folks think that means that you and I, because we're Christians, we have this kind of superpower, we can just do anything. That is not the meaning of that verse. The meaning of that verse is in the context of being contented. And so when Paul says, I can do everything through Him who gives me strength, this is referring to how he manages to be contented in each and every circumstance. We ought not lose sight of that. He reiterates this in a letter to young Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. Godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of it. If we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. So the opposite of coveting is contentment. The opposite of coveting is contentment. But this morning, I want to kind of engage us in a little bit of a gut check about what do we mean when we talk about contentment. Because I'm of the opinion that a lot of times we have very wrong definitions of contentment. We have very wrong ideas about how contentment happens. How do we become contented individuals? And so just a quick little contentment quiz this morning. Are we content when circumstances are less than ideal? I ask that question because a lot of times you and I think that contentment only happens when everything around us is good, when everything is ideal, when everything is, from our opinion, as it should be. When that happens, when all those pieces kind of fall in place, we think then that is how contentment happens. That's what brings about contentment. I would suggest to you this morning that if that is how we think contentment occurs, if we think that is the basis for contentment, that everything is ideal, all situations are ideal, I would say to you, based upon Philippians chapter 4, that is wrong. Because what does Paul say? He says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstance, which tells me he knows how to be contented when circumstances are not ideal. Is our contentment consistent? Are we kind of contented in one season, but discontented in another? Contented one week, but discontented the next? Again, the kind of contentment that Paul is writing about here in Philippians chapter 4 is one that is very consistent. Right? In times of plenty, in times of want, whatever the circumstance, I'm contented. I would ask and invite us to think about what are the main barriers to our being authentically content. Let me give you just two more, and this list could go on a little further. Does contentment to us really mean resignation? And by that I mean, is this where we just kind of say, well, you know what, I'll never have, and we just kind of throw up our hands and go, you know, okay, I'll just be content. Is that what contentment means? It's just kind of resignation, it's just kind of surrender to whatever the circumstances are, okay, whatever. If that's what contentment means, there's no joy, there's no victory in that, there's no satisfaction in that. But a lot of people think that's what contentment means. It just kind of is resignation. Let me give you what I think is a more seductive, false definition of contentment. A lot of people think contentment and being comfortable are the same thing. A lot of folks will define contentment as being comfortable. And so if I'm comfortable, I'm contented. And if we're operating in that notion that contentment only happens when we're comfortable, and comfort and contentment are basically kind of the same thing, again, if we hold that up to the mirror of Philippians 4, the truth therein, we'll find that's not what contentment really is. But I would suggest to you this morning that for a lot of folks, these are their kind of ideas about how contentment works and how contentment is defined and what contentment really is. And you know what? When you and I operate out of these false premises about contentment, we're guaranteed to never have it. We're guaranteed to never have it. And so this morning, I want us to drill down into what Paul gives to us about contentment here in this kind of just brief slice of the letter to the Philippians. And the first place I want to begin is by taking not only the witness of Philippians 4 and the witness of 1 Timothy 6, but the witness of other places in Scripture, and let us begin with a biblical definition of what contentment really is. We're going to have to set aside all that other stuff. A biblical definition of contentment is this: a confident resting in God's sufficient provision. A confident resting in God's sufficient provision. And when you and I begin to think about what contentment is in that context, then we begin to understand how Paul can say, you know what, in times of plenty, in times of want, in good circumstances, in not so good circumstances, I have learned to be content. I have learned to confidently rest in God's sufficient provision. That's what contentment means biblically. So it's not about everything's ideal. It's not about you and I being comfortable. It's not about, I just kind of give up and just, I'm resigned to my whatever. A confident resting in God's sufficient provision. I want to give you three things this morning about contentedness based upon that working definition that Paul shares here in Philippians chapter 4. Number one, contentment is a learned attitude. Notice that twice in these three verses, Paul says, I have learned to be content. The second time he says it, he says, I have learned the secret of being content. So the first and kind of most obvious thing that jumps out to us from Paul's spiritual autobiography here in regards to contentment is it is a learned attitude. Contentment is not automatic. Contentment just doesn't happen. It's not like you make a profession of faith and all of a sudden you're just contented. Paul says here, I have learned to be contented. It's a learned attitude. It happens as you and I grow in and mature in and go deeper into our relationship with Jesus Christ. The deeper that is, the more contentment we will have, and the more that you and I will embrace the truth and the reality that contentment is the confident resting in God's sufficient. Some of you have heard me tell this before, but I'll tell it again in the context of a learned attitude. When I was in the 4th grade up the street here at Raleigh Court Elementary School, I signed up for orchestra. Now, let me just say to you, 24th graders sitting in a room with violins and orchestra does not make. But that's what the class was called. And so I signed up for orchestra. And so there I was. Bill Kinsey was the strings teacher. And Bill he deserved some kind of like citation, Purple Heart, Merit Award, something like that. So there we were, and we all got handed violins. And in 4th grade, the way Bill Kinsey did orchestra was he would sit all the students around in kind of a half or a 2/3 circle with him in the middle, and we were, in other words, everybody was kind of on equal footing, right? None of us knew the violin, and so, everybody was kind of on equal footing. When we got to 5th grade orchestra, then Bill Kinsey set the room up as if we were kind of in a little small orchestra. So you had first violin and second violin and third violin. You with me? So everybody, everything kind of was set, in rows, front to back. And if you know anything about an orchestra, you know that your best player is always front, and then it kind of works its way back. And so that's how we were set up and arranged in 5th grade. I quickly learned as I got to 6th grade orchestra, and then moved with Bill Kinsey to Woodrow Wilson and was in 7th grade orchestra. The longer I stayed in orchestra, the further back my chair went. And I remember Bill Kinsey came up to me one day after orchestra, and he said, "Nelson, have you ever thought about playing the viola?" And I said, "No." He said, "Would you like to play the viola?" And I said, "No." And I only realized years later that was his, bless his heart, his strategy to get me off the violin, because the viola section was even a little further. I gifted Bill Kinsey in 8th grade. I gave him an amazing gift in 8th grade when I did not sign up for orchestra for the 9th grade. It was one of the greatest days in his teaching career. I have no doubt. Why did I keep moving back? Let me tell you what some of the other kids were doing. We all got issued a violin and a violin case by the school system. They were taking their cases home after school. With music to practice. My case never left the school property. There were like little weekend clinics and little weekend kind of little elementary and middle school concert things that you could sign up for and participate in. I did not. Some of these folks even signed up for a few individual lessons. It's little wonder then that when it got to be 8th grade, at the end of 8th grade, I kind of said, you know what? You have to learn to play the violin. You have to practice at it. You have to be committed to it. You have to rehearse. You have to be mentored. You have to learn how to play the violin. We need to understand that contentment is a learned attitude. We have to practice it. We need mentoring. It takes time. takes commitment. And so the first thing that we need to acknowledge right up front is contentment is not automatic. It doesn't just happen. It is a learned attitude. And if Paul writes twice in 3 verses, I have learned to be content, we need to take note of that. Secondly, contentment means or implies sufficiency. The word contentment, this is really, I think, very interesting, and it's a powerful word picture about what really is the meaning of contentment. Contentment, in Paul's day, literally meant self-sufficient. But of course, Paul is not talking about self-sufficiency, because contentment here is everything is through him, is through Christ. So this isn't self-sufficiency, this is Christ dependency, Christ sufficiency. And in Paul's day, it had this word of it had this meaning of everything is sufficient. Everything that is necessary is now provided. And in fact, the English word, and here's where we kind of go with the word image, the English word for counting comes from the same root word for contentment. County as in Roanoke County. And the way that it was supposed to work was that as leaders looked out across a piece of geography, they would look at a footprint and say, how many towns and villages are in that particular territory? Is there a water source? Is there land sufficient for crops? And after they had kind of checked a myriad of boxes, they would then draw some boundaries and say that now is a county, meaning it can support itself, meaning even more sufficiently, nothing has to come from the outside into the county for it to have sufficiency. That's what the word county literally means. Paul here, in using this word contentment, is saying clearly and metaphorically through use of the word that when you and I are in Jesus Christ, when all of who we are and what we are is as a result of coming through Him, we don't need anything else. We don't need anything from the outside to be imported into our lives for you and I to have sufficient provision. And so the second thing that we gain from Paul is his use of language here, his intentional choice of word to understand that contentment implies sufficiency. Our sufficiency is in Jesus Christ. And then finally, I just want to quickly break down that little last sentence that Paul gives to us there in this slice of Scripture that we looked at this morning in Philippians 4:13. He says, I can do everything through Him, Christ, who gives me strength. Again, contentment is this confident resting in God's sufficient provision. Let me just give you some spiritual blessings that Paul is resting in here based upon this verse. First of all, I can do all things. The spiritual blessing of possibility. You could write in the word power if you want to. I'm going to use 4 P's here because that's kind of how I like to do things. Possibility. That means, says to me, it is possible for me to have hope in the midst of loss. It is possible for me to have grace in the midst of shame. It is possible for me to know and experience love in the midst of fractured relationship. It is possible for me to know courage in the midst of struggle. You with me? All things are possible. I can do everything. Paul rests confidently in that sufficient provision. Secondly, I can do all things through Him, the spiritual blessing of presence, the presence of Jesus Christ. All of this is based upon that. Through Him who gives, you can write in the word provision. Whatever it is that you and I need, God provides. Whatever it is that is required for our contentedness, God can source to our lives. I can do everything through Him who gives me strength. You can write in fourth P, peace. Peace. No matter what it is I'm going through, no matter what the circumstance, I can have strength, I can have confidence, I can have peace. And I can rest in that. And that is the source, and that is the secret, Paul says, of my contentedness in all circumstances. I want to close with this illustration. There is a guy by the name of Bob Perks, and he's a pretty well-known speaker. And anyway, he was talking about being in an airport one day, and he is kind of lingering in the atrium of the airport, not quite ready to go through security and all of that, just kind of enjoying the amenities of a large airport. And he said he witnessed the scene between a rather elderly father and his middle-aged daughter. So it's kind of a good Father's Day illustration. And anyway, he said that they're very emotional. The two are very emotional, and they're kind of embracing and hugging, and it's obvious she's getting ready to go through airport security and head on into the interior of the airport. And so he said, I really couldn't help but notice this kind of interaction and exchange between the dad and his daughter. And anyway, he said he overheard them say to each other, not goodbye. They did not say goodbye. The dad looked at his daughter and said, I wish you enough. And the daughter, tearing up, hugged her dad and looked into his face and said, Dad, I wish you enough. And with that, one last hug, and then she headed into airport security. And so anyway, this guy came and sat about a seat or two away from Bob, as he was kind of wanting to get one last glimpse of his daughter before, once she cleared security, before she headed on down deeper into the terminal. And Bob said, I really didn't want to intrude upon that kind of private moment that they had, but he said the man looked at me and he said, have you ever said goodbye to someone and thought it might be your final farewell? And Bob said, well, no, I don't think I've had that experience. And this elderly gentleman, he said, well, I just have a myriad of health problems. He said, my daughter, who is going through security, literally works and lives on the other side of the planet. She only gets home once, maybe twice a year. And he said, in that moment, he said, I'm cognizant that I may be seeing my daughter for the last time in this life. It's pretty deep stuff. And so they continued the conversation a little bit more, and Bob said he looked at the man, and he said, well, I didn't mean to, wasn't trying to listen in, but he said, I couldn't help but overhear that you all really didn't say goodbye to each other, but you said, I wish you enough. They said, I've never heard that before. And the man smiled, and he said, yeah, it's a family tradition. He says it goes back a couple generations. It's what my grandparents said to my parents, and my parents said to me, and now I say to my daughter. And he said, we really don't kind of do the traditional goodbye, but we say to each other when we're parting, I wish you enough. And he said, what we're meaning by that is that as you go into life, and whatever it brings, may you have enough, in his case, to be happy, however you want to fill that blank in. I wish you enough. Can I baptize that illustration for just a second as we close? You and I don't have to sit here this morning and say to God, I wish for enough. We have enough. We have enough.
Amen.
Whatever the circumstance, Paul says, I'm content. We have the opportunity, the choice. Contentment is a choice. To confidently rest in the sufficient provision of God in Christ. Let's pray. Father God, we often, we get so sidetracked by these false definitions of what contentment is. And we operate in those falsehoods and then wonder why we're not contented. So this morning, may we learn from these wonderful words of the Apostle Paul about contentment. That contentment is not automatic, but it's learned as we go deeper into our relationship with you. The more contentment we'll know. And Lord, that contentment isn't being comfortable, and contentment isn't just blind resignation, and contentment isn't that all